We are live.
Well, good evening, everybody. This is the significantly underdressed Tim Terranova, Superintendent of the Victor Central School District, with my esteemed colleague, Assistant Superintendent for Business, Jay Schickling. How you doing, Jay?
Good evening.
As I said before we went on camera, you look very good. I appreciate one of us is just.
This is the school business person Super Bowl, so I wanted to make it an occasion.
I appreciate it. So today is our budget hearing. Really important meeting to discuss the budget. We're going to go through a presentation of the budget, and then we have some thought exchange comments and questions that we'd like to go through from the thought exchange that was put up this weekend. And then we hope to tonight get to some Facebook Live questions, as well as any other information that Jay might want to share tied to the budget. We're certainly going to answer any of our Facebook Live questions by Friday as we move through this. So we're going to try to get to some of those questions, but want to definitely start off with a discussion on the budget. We want to throw the PowerPoint up there, Mr. Schickling. That would be great. And I'll start with the objectives, I think. There we go. So, so here's our objectives for tonight, to really talk a little bit more about why we're in this position financially, what is in the budget and what does it try to attempt to accomplish, and what happens if the budget is defeated, and how are those reductions determined, and then of course what's the district's plan moving forward. So those are our four objectives for tonight. And as I said multiple times, it's a complex reason why we're financially in this situation. But ultimately, since right around 2000, maybe a little bit before, we've gained close to 1,200 students between then and now, which is a significant number. And actually, we've gained over 12% since 2007, 2008. And that's put a significant stress on the revenue. It's really a revenue issue, as we've talked about. Trying to keep up with that number of students and that increase in the last 20 years. And then, of course, in the last 12 years to 8 years has been a significant challenge in terms of keeping up with that revenue. So what has happened is, as Jay's going to talk about in a minute, a state aid was affected by that. The lack of revenue through sales tax has an impact on that. And, the need to try to be as conservative as possible around taxes to support the community impacts that. Ultimately, what happened was, as I've said multiple times, the last few years, we've really been spending, really budgeting for as much money as we have to spend. And really that leaves almost no leeway for any savings or emergency situations. So you get into the scenario we've talked about, which is really living paycheck to paycheck as a school district over the last few years. And again, that strain of significant enrollment, what has happened is we've increased enrollment, and the district has tried to increase staff during that time, which it has, but it's really barely been able to keep up in terms of the staffing. And so what that leads to is this situation where now our revenue is our expenses are outpacing our revenue. So the expenses are greater than the revenue coming in, which is a challenge. And then the expenses are increasing greater than our revenue is increasing, which is a second challenge to all of this. And that's what we need to try to rectify. We need to try to switch that and flip that over the next few years, which is something that is we're going to do strategically. For this particular year, though, what has happened is, as we moved through the last few years and we budgeted paycheck to paycheck, we've spent down our savings to pay for expenses, to try to keep, again, tax rate and per pupil expenditure low. And now we're at a point where we don't have enough revenue to pay for the existing expenses next year by about $3.2 to $3.3 million. So we are definitely under revenue. It has a lot of factors to it, but ultimately we need to figure out a way to straighten this financial situation out. And that's what we're going to talk to you about tonight. So Jay's going to talk a little bit more about the why, and then we're going to get into what we're proposing and what the Board of Education adopted and consequences related to a failure of this budget and what would happen next. So Jay, I'll turn it over to you to talk a little bit more about the why.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Terranova. So when we talk about school finance, it's a difficult concept because what we're looking at is public fund accounting. It's different than how a business operates. And so trying to really break that down to anybody in the community into something that can be digested is what we're looking at with this attempt at a budget triangle. So we're really talking about three things that we need to manage. One of them is our sources of revenue. Where does the money come from that supports the school district? In Victor, about 2/3 of that dollar figure comes from the property tax levy. And then about 1/3 of that figure comes from New York State aid. And there's a small residual balance that's local revenue, like investment of our cash resources before we expend them for payroll, things like that, that return a little bit of revenue to us. In terms of expenditure, primarily what you're seeing in expenditures is the programs and services that are offered by the school district. So there are some overhead administrative costs that are not directly related to instruction, but the majority of our budget is staffing and personnel, and then the remainder is upkeep of our district's buildings, and all of that goes towards the programs and services that we offer to our community. And then lastly is fund balance, which is essentially the net position that is a result of those two things. So if we are seeing revenues to fund our programs that exceed what we're spending, then we accumulate a fund balance. And if we have expenditures that cost greater than our sources of revenue, then we are decreasing our fund balance by utilizing some of that accumulation. And so in 4 of the past 7 budget years, we have had a reduction of fund balance. In one case above $1 million, where we are utilizing some of that long-term accumulated savings to finance some of our repetitive expenditures. And we, at this point, don't believe that that's a sustainable practice. Moving forward here, as Dr. Terranova was speaking to, this is an overlay of the tax rate in the district since the year 2000 in conjunction with the enrollment in the district since the year 2000. And so what you're seeing is a steep and precipitous decline in the tax rate from nearly $21 per thousand to where we are at $15.90 per thousand. And during the same time period where you see the rapid decrease in the tax rate, you also see a rapid increase in student enrollment. And so that's the challenge that Victor faced in terms of trying to allocate resources into classrooms to make sure there were enough desks and available space and staff to provide sections of education, whether that's a classroom instructor, whether that's additional coaching resources, whatever need be, at the same time that there was not really an increase in the revenue basis. And then in the 2013 calendar year, 2012, the tax cap went into place. And so that structural relationship was locked into place. And that's since then, as a result of development in the district, we've seen that tax rate either stabilize or decrease further. So looking at what this budget is and what this budget intends to accomplish, the proposed budget would represent an increase of about $4.5 million. And we'll talk about where that money is going in terms of what we plan to spend it on in a later slide. That represents a 6.14% increase. That's a lower increase budget to budget from the tax cap compliant budget increase last year. So again, it's not always a direct relationship to the tax cap as to what we're seeing for an increase in budget. This does represent an override of the tax cap with a levy growth of 9%, and that would lead to an anticipated tax rate of roughly $17.14. And of course, we're very careful to say that is a projection because that is going to be subject to the assessments that are established in July by the assessors of multiple different towns that have students attending program in the district. And we know that those equalization rates change and that the relationship between those tax rates can vary. Moving on to what that means for a homeowner. Again, this is based upon our true tax rate. So the equalizations between individual towns may vary as to what the rate becomes, but that is intended essentially to make sure that a home at the same market value will have an equivalent tax bill, regardless of which of our townships you reside in. And so for the rate that we're projecting, At the assessed value of $100,000, this would represent an increase of about $90, which is roughly equivalent to $7 per month. And that's for a homeowner with the basic STAR homestead exemption. And for a $200,000 home, that's an annual increase of about $215, $213, roughly $17 to $18 per month, and so on. And so again, the goals that the board has established with this type of funding increase would be to preserve the existing programs. We're also aware of the fact that the state of New York faces a $13 billion revenue deficit right now, and nobody in the state can determine what's going to happen as to how the state is going to respond to that. So there's some federal government stimulus that is being discussed, in Washington, that could help to supplement some of that lost revenue and may insulate districts against aid decreases. But there's also the potential that we could find out in February, for example, that we're going to lose some of the aid we were anticipating. And it's also planning to decrease a reliance upon the use of that fund balance or the reserves that we discussed earlier. And again, I want to address that the STAR exemption program is not related to the school budget, meaning that whether the budget is or is not tax cap compliant does not have a bearing upon an individual's eligibility for the STAR program. There had been a property tax relief check that was tied to a tax cap compliant budget vote within the district, but that program has sunsetted, so it no longer exists for the 2020 budget year, and that was part of the governor's budget process that was passed by the legislature.
So go ahead, Jay, sorry.
No, go ahead, Dr. Chernow. I believe you were going to speak to the consequences.
As Jay was discussing it, this, as we talked earlier, this is a situation where we are attempting to preserve programs. We are attempting to not use any more of our reserves that are at less than 5% of our total budget right now. And we're also attempting to mitigate state aid loss. We are not in any way able, we don't believe anyway, to increase staffing even in the areas that are critically low right now. That would be safety and security, cleaning and health, technology integration, as we've seen, through the COVID virtual technology implementation, and other areas that are critical, like student mental health, although we are able to increase one position at the high school in counseling, which will support it. The bottom line is this is a long-term process, but to initially, focus on keeping our existing programming, saving our reserves, and attempting to mitigate state aid loss is the critical areas of focus. If this doesn't happen and we're not able to exceed the tax cap by a 60% majority, then this budget ended up at the tax cap, which I believe is 1.96% increase in the tax levy, then we would have to reduce our budget by about $3.2 to $3.4 million. And that's when these decisions unfortunately have to be made, which is really mandatory versus discretionary. We have 95% or more of our budget is mandatory. We are an incredibly lean budget based upon the fact that we're the lowest per pupil expenditure in the state. So there's not a lot of room to cut. Where we have to cut, we're going to have to do it mostly in discretionary funding. And we're going to have to look at programs versus people. So sometimes, unfortunately, we have to cut people to keep programming, but increase class sizes. And we're also going to have to cut people that reduces programming because we don't have a choice. We're also looking at equity across the K-12 program and certainly the impact on students. So Jay, if we go to the next slide, I'll review the focus areas of reduction if the budget doesn't achieve a 60% approval percentage. We would be cutting 21.6 teachers between the elementary and the secondary level. A big focus in the elementary level would be taking our instructional coaches, enrichment teachers, and mentors and putting them back in the classroom, which would then reduce teachers based upon seniority according to state law. That would also increase elementary class sizes. We would replace our standards leaders at the secondary level, as well as reduce teachers in phys ed, ELA, math, social studies, science, business, student support services, to try to get to the money that we need to save. Because as we mentioned before, again, most of this is discretionary. So the only way to save close to over $3 million is unfortunately to cut salaries and benefits. And that's where it hits. We also have to, though, reduce discretionary spending, which includes coaching stipends for modified sports, the aquatic center itself, which again is not it costs $17 a year per, I think, taxpayer roughly to pay for the actual facility, because that was done through a capital project years in the past. But the cost right now is on keeping it running from morning till night with all the great aquatics programs that we have, kindergarten through 12th grade and beyond, and includes our varsity and JV boys and girls swim program. So that would save significant amount of money. I've said it before, and it's just the truth. We're going to have to drain the pool, which will save an additional $60,000 and potentially saves a course or a program at a different level. Then we have data management coordinator reduction, K-12 teacher leader reductions, public relations staff reductions. We would be cutting school psychologist positions, both a K-12 position as well as an intern, special area teachers, because we're cutting elementary, especially at the elementary level, but we're cutting classes at that level. So we're not going to have as many art, music, and phys ed classes, which would mean class sizes would increase. We'd also be reducing the Suzuki Strings program at the elementary level. Teacher aides as well as stipends. A large chunk of this reduction would also be in extracurricular and clubs, unfortunately, because we can get somewhere between $100,000 and $200,000 worth of savings with that. This impacts programming. On the next slide, Jay. Administrative expenses reductions will happen. Aquatic center, phys ed swim program, and swim teams. We have to reduce at least 3 of our advanced placement courses, as well as a variety of elective courses at the high school, which has two impacts, where it's going to dump more of our high school kids into study halls during the day, and certainly reduce their options for a comprehensive education. Curriculum and teacher leadership reductions, I said that already. That's going to hurt us because it will put them back in the classroom, and also reduce teachers that are currently doing a great job in the classroom. And also it'll reduce our opportunity for instructional and curriculum leadership as we try to implement 21st century learning standards. The enrichment program at the K-6 level would have to be eliminated. We would need to charge for facilities usage at a level that, so that we don't have to pay any money for that usage. So that would put a financial burden on outside groups right now. And then, of course, we would be reducing modified athletics, 7th, 8th, and 9th grade for those sports that have 9th grade modified, as well as the aquatics program. So as we've used the example before, this really puts our kids in a challenge, especially at the junior high level, who may not be able to participate in a modified sport, may not be able to participate in a club or experience like marching band or some other the musical, and may also struggle to participate in a youth event if the youth group is supposed to use our facilities because of the money that it's going to cost to do that. So that's going to be a challenge to the community. Support services elimination at the junior high level. Teacher will be going back to the classroom that's supporting our student mental health and our social emotional needs of kids. And then, of course, clubs, musicals, plays, Suzuki Strings, and also a reduction of our UPK program. We would keep the full day UPK, but we would be reducing our half day UPK up to the amount of money we receive for a grant, because that would save us money to the $3.3 million range. This is the challenge. This is the facts. These are the facts of what happens if we're not able to exceed the tax cap, which is why the board adopted this budget in this really horrific economic time. And I know that's a few of the questions on Facebook as well as the thought exchange. Why are we doing this now? Because we are attempting to save program and keep this district at a comprehensive level, similar to all the districts around us. We're attempting that will also save jobs. We're not doing it to save jobs because those jobs save programs, but in a situation where other people are losing their jobs around us, we believe it's positive that we keep people working in the community and keep these jobs going. And we're not doing what we probably need, what we most likely will need over the next few years, which is we're not attempting to increase staffing other than the mandated positions. We understand that this is going to be a challenge to the community, and that would certainly be a significant challenge. So that's the situation we're in, and that's trying to be as transparent as possible with you of what we're trying not to have happen. Jay, can we talk a little bit more now around if the budget does pass, what that would mean with the rate of the per pupil expenditure?
Absolutely. So these are projections as to what it would look like to our best estimation if the budget was successful. So what you're seeing here is a true value tax rate and a per pupil expenditure. And these projections are in comparison to the best information that we have available, especially for per pupil expense. That data is from the 17-18 school year coming from the New York State Comptroller. So Victor's projected budget divided by enrollment, our per pupil expenditure, would be roughly $18,000 for the 2021 school year in comparison to an average for Monroe County, Wayne County, and Ontario County as pictured from the 17-18 school year. In terms of true value tax rate, this is the best information available for 2019 versus Victor's projected tax rate of 17-14 in the future. So again, you see that the tax rate would still be roughly $2 less than Ontario County's average, roughly $4 less than Wayne County's average, and roughly $8 less than Monroe County's average. And on the per pupil expenditure side, if you were to look at the distance between Victor's per pupil expenditure and what an average Monroe County, Wayne County, or Ontario County school is paying to fund the education of their students, you would see an additional multi-millions of dollars on top of Victor's budget to equalize those figures. So we are paying substantially less to provide a high quality education right now, and will continue to do so. In terms of what the expenditures within the budget look like, there is a prescribed format that the state asks districts use to present their budget. So this is a broad picture here in terms of where we're allocating certain money and what the percent change is. In terms of salaries, it's really important for us to note that 4.7% doesn't mean that everybody is getting a 4.7% raise. That's been a prominent question. So there are 6 positions in here that we have made the determination need to be added. And that is because of state regulation or mandate in terms of student to teacher ratio for providing certain services, in particular in the special education area, and our increasing population of students who require learning of English as a second language. And also a school counselor, as Dr. Terranova mentioned, because of some of the challenges in our social emotional health, and also counseling our students in terms of career paths and placements outside of Victor Central Schools when they matriculate. There's also some costs in here that are shifted to the district by the state's budget in terms of when we have students that have exceptional needs that are placed in programs outside of the district, that the district doesn't have the ability to meet their needs with its internal programs. And then there's a substantial increase to the healthcare premiums and the contribution rate to the teacher's retirement system. And the district purchases healthcare through a consortium of all the Wayne Finger Lakes schools in order to provide the best leverage possible to get a well-rated product and an experience-rated product for the region. And so that's our best effort to mitigate high costs of healthcare. But what we have seen is that consortium, there have been a lot of high cost claims coming in, and that's leading to the consortium overall, all the Finger Lakes schools, having to absorb large premium increases. And in terms of the teachers' retirement system and the employees' retirement system, these are constitutionally protected benefits by the state of New York's Constitution for our employees that are eligible to participate in those systems. And they're largely reliant upon returns from the stock market or the financial market. So when the market is doing well, we see our rates decline. And when the market has a year that closed flat or down like last year, we're going to see an increase in those premiums. And so that's what you're seeing here, in addition to a noteworthy increase in the number of students that we've got that do require some additional services, whether they be health related or special education, both in and out of district. And there's a process for those things where a consortium gets together of healthcare providers, educators, administrators, and they make the best recommendation as to what that student needs. And then it's the district's obligation to finance those recommendations. In terms of how the budget is going to be funded on the revenue side, primarily, as we focused on at the beginning of the presentation, primarily the increase to revenue is our proposal for the property tax levy, and in addition, some increase to our payments in lieu of tax agreements, which are going to be commercial properties that have particular contracts for the payments they'll make to the district rather than paying property taxes as an abatement agreement with the Industrial Development Agency. In New York State aid, what you're seeing here is relatively flat. Again, the foundation formula is held at 0 increase from last year, so we're getting the same foundation aid we got last year if there are no reductions, which is something that we've talked about and we'll need to plan for if we find out mid-year that there is going to be a reduction in aid. We do have some options available to us in response. The only other format we receive aid in is based upon our building, our transportation, or our BOCES expenses. And because those expenses increased last year per regular contractual obligations, there's a slight increase in expense-based aid. What we are anticipating is seeing reduced revenue in terms of our investment interest. So because the market is performing poorly currently, and we anticipate it'll be doing so into the next year, we're not anticipating generating as much interest returns on our investments, which really are represented by the tax levy as we hold that in account before it's expended on our operations. And then use of fund balance is considered stable. As Dr. Terranova mentioned earlier, one of the things that this budget does is it provides a slightly higher contingency for risk within the budget, meaning we don't anticipate that we will be expending 99.9% of the budget like we did last year. We anticipate we'll be expending closer to 98% of the budget. And so that's part of that anticipation that while we're budgeting this as a revenue, we're hopeful that we won't have to use all of it. And that would allow us to stabilize our fund balance in the long term and not rely upon utilizing it for operational expenses. In terms of how much of the budget is allocated to certain areas, you can see the largest component of the budget is regular school instruction. That's all of your general education, teaching, and support. That is almost a third of our budget. Employee benefits, obviously, because we're a labor-intensive industry, the employee benefits are a substantial component. Again, a lot of those are payroll tax, New York State pension system, that is a mandatory obligation. Those are just essentially the costs of employing folks. And then special instruction is next, and that 12% is roughly equivalent to our classification rate, which means somewhere around 10 to 12% of our students are receiving services for special education at this time. Beyond that is debt service. Again, this is capital and bus bond obligations from borrowings. I do want to reiterate that close to 75, even 80% of this debt is supported by building and transportation aid that is being recouped by the district from the state. And so if we were not engaging in capital work and we were not refreshing our bus fleet, we also would not be capturing that aid that is comprised of the taxes paid to the state by our taxpayers. And so on the revenue side, there is an offset to the majority of that debt service. And then you see other items here. One of the noteworthy items that has been the subject of many questions is library and instructional technology. So a smaller component of budget at 2.4%. And then the entirety of the modified through varsity athletic programs, including a lot of the operating costs of the aquatic center at roughly 1.4% of budget. So again, if there is a perception that a lot of our resources are being allocated to those particular items, I think that proportionally, the dollar amount that this represents is about $1 million. So that's roughly about 1/3 of what our budget gap represents. Even eliminating all athletic programs would not be resolving the structural issue that we're facing between revenues and expenditures. In presenting this as a three-part, I'll try to be brief, but the state asks us to portray the administrative costs, the program costs related to providing instruction to students and other related services, and then the capital component of our budget. So in the administrative component, while there is an increase in overall dollars spent, the size of the administrative component in our budget is being reduced. So we're going from over 10% of the budget to about 9.9% of the budget. Again, there's some shifting based upon the state's new rules for accountability and building level reporting, where there are some dollar figures being shifted from one code to another. But in the size of growth of this area, you're actually seeing a smaller component of the budget next year than currently exists. The program component is by far the largest component. It also is the only component that's demonstrating growth from one year to the other in terms of the size of budget. So in this component, there's a market increase in teaching salaries. That's because of those positions we referenced earlier. And there's a market increase in employee benefits because of the rate increases that we discussed earlier. And then between the codes, again, there are some changes being made in terms of where the state is asking us to report certain expenditures. But the majority of this increase is directly in instructional salaries and related benefits. In the capital component, this would be related to the debt obligations and all of the operations and maintenance of the district. This component is actually being reduced in overall expenditure and in its proportional size of the budget. And part of that is related to reduced borrowing costs. Part of that is because we had strategically made some prepayments on some debt obligations that allow us to have smaller borrowing costs moving forward from this time. So we're realizing that on this budget line here. And I believe Dr. Terranova at this point is going to speak to a little bit of what we view as our strategic planning moving forward to address one of the questions, which is how do we ensure that we're going to be able to sustain the district moving forward?
Thanks, Jay. Appreciate that information. So yeah, one of the things we need to really focus on is strategically planning forward. We're trying to keep our existing programs this year, trying not to dip into our reserves and mitigating for state aid loss. But it's going to take time to really get to the heart of the matter, which is right now we have a revenue issue and we also have a strategic planning need. And what does that mean? Well, we're looking to, over the next 5 years, really plan out what this district and community values in its education. We need to focus on that. And we need to have community input on that type of focus. So what is the community value? And then a real emphasis on long-term financial planning that also not just emphasizes, what we need in terms of our enrollment projections as well as our programs, but how do we advocate for a variety of revenue sources beyond taxes? Right now, this district is heavily reliant on tax money. So how do we advocate with the state around state aid increases, as well as potential sales tax revenue through Ontario County, knowing that Ontario County does not offer sales tax to school districts like Wayne and Monroe County does. That's a strong advocacy point, along with the work that we're going to be doing at the state level around state aid to hopefully decrease the need and emphasis on taxes. But right now it's close to 70% of our total revenue is taxes. That all goes along with really focusing on building space and organizational structure. And again, going to about the 40,000 foot level above this, how do we focus on what we value? How do we focus on then decision making and the communication regarding those decisions? And how do we use the community input and the community values to sustain us moving forward so that we can work through the challenges ahead of us in this district and not only meet the needs of our kids and staffing and obviously a comprehensive education, But as people have talked about, really meet those needs of the community in terms of what they can afford to pay for school. The reality is right now, we're even with this increase, we're looking at a $2 less tax rate per 1,000 than the average school districts in Ontario County. So we're not asking to move into the average level. We're not even looking at close to Monroe County averages. We're looking to increase enough to sustain the programs and then strategically plan forward. So that'll be a big emphasis, and it'll be involving the community as much as possible. Thanks, Jay.
So on the ballot, in terms of what the vote is going to look like, obviously it's a much different process this year. Everybody should have received a postcard at home outlining the process, and that process is that the ballot is going to be completed by voters and returned to the school district via U.S. mail, and that's going to include a return envelope. It's important to stress that each registered or qualified voter that we have record of should receive their own ballot in the mail, and each should be enclosing their ballot in the return envelope and signing the affidavit that they are the person who is signing and returning it to us. It should be a 1-for-1 exchange. So we will have to invalidate if we receive multiple ballots in one signed envelope, for example. Those ballots have to be received by the district in hand by 5 p.m. June 9th. So again, that's not a postmark date. That is, the ballots are at the district and have been received by 5 p.m., at which point the district begins to count them. We do plan on having a drop box, and we will publicize the location of that drop box. We're still deciding where the most prominent placement will be. And if there is somebody who is unable to mail their ballot in time, or forgets to mail it by a time they think would be comfortable getting it back to the district, there will be the ability on the 8th and 9th to drop it off in a secure drop box. On the ballot itself, you'll see the first proposition will be the school budget proposition. This is approving the total operating expenditures of the district, and the expenditure value will be listed on the proposition. Every year, Victor also has a proposition to allow the district to bond for a purchase of buses to refresh the bus fleet. And we do that because we have somewhere between 75 and 80 operating buses at any given point, and it wouldn't be prudent for us to replace all of them in the same cycle. So we do that on a yearly refresh of a handful to make sure that those buses cycle through their useful life, and that's a sustainable service that we provide. And also new this year will be the funding for the Victor Farmington Library. That's going to be part of our ballot, and that's paired with the district budget, but that will be the proposition for the Victor Farmington Library and the associated tax levy for that service. Additionally, on the ballot for June 9th is going to be the Board of Education candidates. The candidates this year are to be listed in alphabetical order, so that's a change in process. Before it had been essentially a lottery. But they are listed in alphabetical order from left to right, scrolling through the screen. There are 3 open seats. 2 of them carry a 3-year term, and 1 seat carries a 1-year term. And those seats will be claimed dependent upon the number of votes, with the highest vote tally, 2 highest vote tallies claiming the 3-year term seat, and then the 3rd highest claiming the 1-year term. So at this point, that really wraps up the budget hearing component of tonight's session. I would also make it clear that there are required documents for the district to make available. Those are available on the website this year because traditionally they're in our school buildings or the libraries. And given what's going on with COVID, people are not being encouraged to access the buildings. So they're available on the website, and all of our mandatory disclosures are or can be viewed there. And so, Dr. Terranova, I would turn it back over to you.
Yeah, I'm actually gonna we have a very lively Facebook question and answer thing, so I'm gonna throw some questions at us because it is about 7:09, and I do want to get to people's questions, and we're gonna get to as many as we can, and then we'll answer any other questions on Facebook between now and Friday. One of the questions was, is there a correlation between cost per pupil and school performance? Well, Currently, Victor's cost per pupil, as we've heard 1,000 times in the past 6 weeks, is the lowest in the state, and we have an incredibly high performance in terms of achievement, which is a direct result of everything before I got here, as well as the incredible people that work here and the community members and the kids and the parents and the guardians. So, but I would say if we have to cut $3.2 million from the budget because we can't afford our current per pupil expenditure in terms of the expenses that are out there necessary to run this district, then I think it will, I potentially would have an impact on student performance over time because of the different issues that we would be facing. To have a comprehensive education and stay at a high level research-based level around teaching and learning, we need the proper funding to do that and sustain over 4,000 kids. So that would be my answer to that question. How about savings from school building closures? A couple questions around this, Mr. Schickling. What do we do with it? What's going on? What are the savings and what do we do with the savings from the building closures? And then there's a question about how soon will we open in the fall? I can take that one.
Okay. Yeah, so anytime that we have expenses that don't realize, we would call that cost avoidance. So there are certain expenditures that are not taking place because of the school closure. Now, again, as we spoke a little bit earlier, the majority of any school budget is going to be made up in personnel and staff related services. And so we still do have employees delivering instruction, and we still do have employees that are providing for example, meal service, caring for the grounds, and cleaning after the essential staff that come in, access the buildings. And so, a lot of our budget is going to be programmed expense based upon those contractual obligations and continuing benefits. There are some expenses that we're not going to realize. So that would be fuel for transportation, of course. In some areas, overtime wouldn't be realized. So if we're having to take care of our grounds because of snow, or because in this case now the grass is growing and we have to have extra people come in, any of those overtime expenditures are not going to realize. And in addition, subs costs. So we don't have substitutes that are coming in. These expenses, they represent maybe 0.5% to 1% of our budget. So again, they're not going to be material in terms of addressing our budget deficit. But what does happen when we have unexpended funds is they become part of that fund balance. So we don't anticipate spending 99.9% of our budget this year like we did last year. We anticipate having maybe 1% left over. And what happens then is we can either appropriate that into next year's budget and use it as a one-time revenue source, or it can become fund balance. And then what happens is, as Dr. Terranova is going to speak to in a moment, if there are services that were unanticipated that we need to offer in the fall to reopen, we may be able to utilize some of that fund balance that was realized at the end of this year to fund those services within our overall expenditure budget.
Yeah, so I would just say, again, to the other question around what about the fall? Bottom line is we may save about 1/10 of what we need in terms of the budget gap right now by having these buildings closed. But as Jay talked about, which we would use towards trying to bridge that gap through fund balance. But we also have the state aid issue. If there more state aid is taken back by the state, if they don't meet their own revenue and expense needs, then that money would end up going to that and trying to plug that gap. And if we are back in the fall, which I certainly hope we are, and there is no specific direction yet, we hope to have that direction later in June around what we're going to do in the fall. But if we are back in the fall, here's an example. We're not going to be able to have bathrooms untouched for the entire day while kids go to school in the middle of a COVID crisis. So we're going to have to figure out a way to adjust some of our expenses for cleaning staff to support the safety and health of our kids, which is our #1 priority. So there's going to be some potential expenses that are unanticipated when hopefully we come back in the fall. There's also expenses tied to some of the professional development we're going to need to do with teachers to make sure that if we have to teach through technology and virtually next year at any point, we're going to have a leg up on that. and be more advanced in our practices and our ability to do that. So this is where it all comes into play. We have some savings, but we also have needs around state aid, and we have needs around potential increased expenses moving forward that we have to keep a close eye on. Jay, a lot of questions around, or some questions around special ed costs. I mean, I can talk about our philosophy around special education. Our philosophy is that every child belongs here. And that is absolute and a focus of everyone. At least restrictive environment happens to be the law, and we want to meet the needs of every child. But we also, at the same time, need to make sure our teachers have the correct resources and supports necessary to teach effectively with kids who have either some significant academic needs or significant social emotional needs. So that does cost money. And however, most people would say that it costs significantly more to send children out of district and pay for that, which is also a challenge for all of our districts. So from an ethical standpoint, we're going to do whatever we can over the next 3 to 5 years in our strategic planning to support all kids in a least restrictive environment, but do so by giving our teachers the resources and support and professional development necessary to make that happen. But those things do cost money. I think some specific questions on the cost of special ed, is that even definable to a student, or how would you answer that, Jay?
So one of the disclosures that you'll find in our budget packet is a fiscal supplement. And every year the state releases a fiscal supplement on each school district. And the state will outline that district's expenditure on pupils for regular instructional program and special instructional program. So for somebody who is interested in taking a look at the difference between those levels of expenses, you'll see that for Victor. You'll also see how that compares to a peer group of districts. So the state would define those as suburban districts of average need, quote unquote. And you'll also see how that compares to the statewide average at large.
Some questions around sales tax and its impact. Any comments about that? I mean, I can talk a little bit too after that around what we're trying to do in advocacy for the county, but definitely
Sure.
Some questions around how the community can understand the impact of sales tax.
Sure. Two of our contiguous counties where we do have some residences, we do realize a small amount of sales tax from those counties. Now, those counties share sales tax with the districts that reside within the county, and that being Wayne and Monroe. They do so in different ways, and that's based upon any legal agreement that was established going back years, even decades. So in Monroe, it's going to be based upon the total sales tax receipts of the county, and then those are divided up proportionally and shared with school districts, which means, for example, during a COVID crisis, when sales tax receipts are down due to less economic activity, that's going to be a variable revenue for the districts that do receive that revenue source. So that's going to be reduced. In Wayne County, it's a little bit different. It's a fixed allocation per year that's legally agreed upon, which is $5.4 million between all of the districts in Wayne County. And again, that's based upon a proportionality. So we report our student population that lives within the county, and then that gets divided up and divvied out to school districts based upon that. So the overall aggregate dollar figure is a little bit lower for Wayne County than it is for Monroe. A couple of districts about half our size that you may be familiar with receive sales tax from Wayne County to the tune of about $600,000 to $900,000 per year. Now in Monroe County, there's many districts of comparable size to Victor. A district of that size would be receiving somewhere between $3 and $5 million in sales tax revenue based upon that agreement. So we have reason to anticipate that if Ontario County were to exercise a similar agreement, that could mean a substantial source of recurring revenue to Victor Central Schools.
Thanks, Jay. Yeah, and again, that would reduce the sales tax is challenged right now because there's businesses obviously struggling and going out of business, and sales tax, is going down. But I do appreciate the response from Jack Marin, our supervisor in Victor. We've had conversations with Canandaigua and Geneva School District and Jack, and we are going to continue to have those conversations this summer to see if we can get a win-win with the county to try to get sales tax not only for the schools, but also to support the businesses. So it's an ongoing conversation, but it's not something that's going to happen in the next 2 to 3 weeks. So, but we do appreciate the support of Jack and the work that is ongoing in the collaboration there. A question around state aid. There's some questions just around why are we kind of in the situation that we are in state aid. Jay, do you want to take that one?
Sure. I've got a couple of different prepared slides here to answer some of those questions. So are you able to see my state foundation aid slide right now?
Yes.
Okay, so what happened? This is a historical look at the state aid foundation formula. You see 3 columns there. Current year aid, which is the middle column, is going to be the dollar value that was or is slated to be received by the district. The column on the right is the amount that would be received by the district if the state's foundation formula for school aid was funded. And so this came to fruition based upon a constitutional challenge to the state. The state's constitution has a clause in there requiring comprehensive education to all students. And so there was a challenge to that by an advocacy group, and the state lost. And that's what led to the foundation formula being generated. Then the financial crisis of 2008-2009 hit. And so what the state did is called gap elimination. The state had a crisis for their budget similar to what we're seeing now. And so that is where from 2008-9 to 2011-12, you see really 4 years of the same amount of state aid distributed to school districts. That's what we refer to as the freeze. And from that point forward, rather than funding what the formula would calculate, each district received a tiered increase based upon a formula established by the legislature that was not the foundation aid formula. And so Victor is currently receiving increases off of a baseline that's based upon its 2007-8 enrollment, when its 2018-19 enrollment a year ago is 12 to 13% greater. And so what's happened is we've gained the privilege of being able to educate lots more students with a high quality education, but we haven't realized any additional revenue source from the state that is tied to additional students. We've been receiving what their estimation of aid is based upon the frozen calculation that established that baseline in 2007, 2008. And so the unfunded value, if you look at the last line here, with the state aid being held flat by the state for 2020-21, the calculation for the formula would be 21,189,000. So that leaves us an unfunded value of about 8.9 million. And so aggregate back across all of these years, we're looking at about $100 million of unfunded revenue that would go to support Victor Central Schools.
Right. And a lot of that's going to be trying to attempt to advocate with the state, knowing that the state is struggling with money right now. So
yes, and there are many schools who have seen, in fact, the majority of schools in New York State have seen a decrease in enrollment. And so many of them are still receiving aid, being held harmless off of the same baselines. They have less students, but they're receiving the same amount of money or more. Whereas Victor is receiving about 60% of what the formula calculates. There are many districts that are receiving 90 to 100 to even 140% of what the formula calculates for them.
Do you think we could, I'm gonna maybe because we got about 6-7 minutes left. I want to wrap up in a few minutes, and I appreciate all the information you're giving us. Can we talk just a minute about the role of taxes, the tax levy versus businesses and new homes in the Victor Farmington area? Because there's a lot of questions and confusion around are the new homes and the new businesses in the Eastview Mall and their impact on taxes and supporting the district. Maybe in just I don't know, 2 or 3 minutes, can we just articulate that again? That would be awesome.
Sure. That's a complicated question. So the tax cap formula does allow for an adjustment based upon new residential or commercial development. However, what we've seen at Victor is that the growth in overall assessment value, which could be new properties or existing properties, has exceeded the growth of the tax levy. So what happens when the district or when the Board of Education establishes a tax levy, that's the dollar amount that the district is proposing to collect in order to fund programs. And so just to break that down to a real simple calculation, if the district was to propose a levy of $100 and there were 100 homes in the district, each home would be paying $1. It's 100 divided by 100. So what we've seen happen is the tax cap has limited the growth of what the levy calculation is, but the property assessments, because of either increased assessment values or new development, has increased. And so when that numerator remains the same or slightly increased, and then the property values, new or existing, increase, that doesn't generate additional revenue to the district. What happens is the levy remains the same, and the proportional, I would call it the slice of the pie, gets smaller. And that's what's happened as the tax rate has been reduced, is that relationship between tax levy and assessment values or property wealth within the district has changed. And so our tax rate has remained stable or decreased. So what may happen is a new home may be built, 3 pupils may move in, and the district is going to educate those pupils, but it doesn't necessarily mean that there's an increase in the tax levy because that levy has already been established.
And then Jay, thank you for that. Can we go back to the early slides? I just want to review a couple of them, make sure people have a sense of what we're attempting here as a district.
Absolutely.
Also want to thank the Board of Education for all the work behind the scenes on this budget. They did adopt this budget back in April. Just a reminder, our budget to budget increase is 6.14%. It's a 9.34% tax levy increase, a 7.8% increase approximate on the tax rate. That increases our tax rate into the $17.14 range. And then over the tax cap of $3.3 million. These are the cost increases. So and you can, most people know their assessed value of their home, and most of your homes are somewhere in this range, somewhere in between these ranges. So again, for a $300,000 house, it's an increase of approximately $338 with basic star, which is $28.13 a month increase. Jay, if we can go to the slide that shows the tax rate and per pupil expenditure, if we pass the budget, that'd be awesome. As we talked about earlier, the per pupil expenditure, the tax rate is going to go a little above $17, which is still $2 below the average Ontario County tax rate and significantly under the Monroe County, Wayne County, and Ontario tax per pupil expenditures. We are not looking to try to increase the tax rate to the average of Ontario County schools. We're asking to increase it to $2 below that average. If we're able to do that, we sustain the current programming, we save our reserves, and we have at least some balance and savings for state aid. We still need to plan forward over the next 3 to 5 years to support the continued, although much less than it was, increase in enrollment, complex needs of our kids, and understaffed areas that we're not addressing right now. But we're going to need to do that with community input. We're going to need to do that in sort of a shared value way with the community, because we understand it's that delicate balance between what can this community afford and what type of school district do we want as a community. Right now, the choice is, it's a community choice. Do we want a district that is comprehensive and includes the experiences that people love and know that occur every day in Victor? Or do we want a significantly different looking district in terms of opportunities for kids, class sizes, and impact on the community? Jay, if you could just show that slide before this, please. This is what would happen. Actually, we can go to the next one, Jay. That'd be great. Thank you. This is what would occur if we're not able to achieve the 60% approval rate for this particular budget, because it does need a 60% rate because it's above the tax cap. So this is our situation. We encourage everybody to register to vote. It's not too late to register to vote. However, it's getting late. So we would definitely want to encourage you to register this week if you have not registered yet. contact our board clerk, Maureen Goodberley, who's doing an incredible job attempting to get this by mail vote structured appropriately. Contact her if you register this week so that she could be looking for your name on the register vote, and then we will mail you a ballot. And then make sure you follow the processes on the ballot to get this ballot back to us by June 9th at 5 p.m. I will continue to answer your Facebook questions between now and Friday. Please go to our website, victorschools.org, go to the budget section, which has tremendous details around our budget. Feel free to email me if you want to ask any questions, have a phone call, do a Zoom session with anybody. We'll do that at any time between now and the budget vote. If you have further questions or want to dialogue about this budget, we're going to be as transparent as possible around what the needs are of this school district. And we deeply appreciate the community input as well as the community connection to this process. We know it's a big decision. Jay, I want to thank you for everything and your great communication today. Is there anything you want to add before we close tonight?
Yeah, I mean, thank you for the opportunity to do so, Dr. Terranova. I think one of the things that these charts demonstrated to me as we put them together was kind of the old adage of one of these things is not like the others. And so I think it's important that as administration of the district representing the school board, we just put forth the best information we have and allow our community to make an objective choice and educate our community. And so, you know, these are what the numbers look like, and our proposal is intended to try to move the district towards insulating what we currently have, but also then a long-term strategic plan, Dr. Terranova, as you spoke to, of providing the services and programs that residents of our district are going to expect if they want to have a similar experience to some of these other areas. And so, you know, I think that's ultimately what the community will decide on. And I'm hopeful that we've provided them the information that allows them to make an educated choice on that.
Thank you, Jay. Appreciate it. Thanks for turning in, everybody. We will have another town hall next week with the hopeful idea of having some of our former graduates who have recently either graduated from college or involved in a work experience. They're going to have great insight on the education of Victor Central School and what they've been doing the last few years. So that's our goal for next week. And again, thanks to everybody, and have a safe evening and take care of yourselves. Thanks, Jay. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Good night.